Good evening, everyone. You ready to start? Excellent. I am James Koster, Executive Director of AI Brooklyn. I want to first welcome you all and thank you for coming to this important panel where we will explore the ongoing themes of uncertainty, this being the second chapter in that story that we're writing. If you didn't sign in, please do, especially if you want an AI learning unit. Thanks also to CityTech for hosting this, and especially to Sanjeev Vaidya and his crew for all the help in getting this set up. I'm going to introduce Sarah Drake, who is president of AI Brooklyn, for a few opening remarks and to get the meeting started.
Hi, thank you, James. And I am here calling this meeting to order. I will start out with a few seconds of chapter business. Our mission, AIA Brooklyn, is dedicated to the advancement of the architectural profession through education, outreach, and mutual support. We will be posting nominations for the AIA Brooklyn 2025 Board of Directors in the next couple of days via email and on our website. The nominations will be ratified in our next general meeting on December 18th. We have some upcoming events. Tomorrow noon via Zoom on the menu, laser scanning and BIM by our sponsor, Existing Conditions. On December 6th, there will be a tour of Greenpoint Environmental Education Center organized by our co-chair, Michelle Todd, for a program hosted by AIA New Jersey from 2 to 4. On December 9th, Brooklyn Design Awards and Holiday Party from 6 to 9 at 501 Union Street. And on December 12th, a DOB industry meeting organized by past President Ida Galea from 2 to 3 at 345 Adams Street, 3rd floor of Brooklyn. It is the address of the Brooklyn DOB. And finally, December 18th, we will have our general meeting, this meeting, via Zoom from 6:30 to 8. All of these events that I've mentioned, links and addresses, etc., ways to register, can be found on our website, www.aaabrooklyn.org. Check out the website, read our What's Happening emails to get up with news. And now I will hand the mic over.
Thank you for that, Sarah. A lot of good stuff happening at AI Brooklyn, a big and busy end of 2024. So check the website. I'm going to introduce Marshall Schuster, who is Vice President of AI Brooklyn, who will tell us a little bit about tonight's topics.
Thank you, James. Tonight's panel discussion is perhaps one of the most important issues facing the profession of architecture today. With massive income inequality, inflation, the affordable housing crisis, wage stagnation, and the increasing influence of artificial intelligence, the question is, can the profession survive without restructuring our relationship to labor? What does the future of the profession look like when the average starting salary of an architect is half the starting salary of a doctor or lawyer? Can we expect young people to stay in the field while salaries remain low and our paid family leave is a fraction of what is provided in other Western countries? Wherever you stand, the value of labor is a critical component in the value of the profession. And how we value labor will affect what the profession looks like in the next 30 years, when most of us will be either retired or at the end of our careers. How will we leave the profession for the next generation of architects?
Thank you, Marshall. So I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists in the order in which they're going to speak, so you don't get confused. So first is Dr. Benjamin Shepard. By day, Ben works as professor of human services here at CityTech. By night, he fights the good fight to keep New York City from becoming a giant shopping mall, and I'm hoping he's going to say more about that. His work often foregrounds an ethnographic understanding of social issues and movements, and he has authored and edited many socially conscious books, including Sustainable Urbanism and Direct Action, illuminations on Market Street, and from ACT UP to the WTO. He is currently completing On Activism and Friendships and Fighting, to be published early next year. Valerie Lechon is... Oh, I didn't know. Okay, excellent. I gotta turn the page. Lee Kuhn hails from UC Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, where he also TA'd a course on energy and the environment. Lee is an associate and director of sustainability at Sage and Coombe Architects, where he also participated as a member of the bargaining committee when that firm became only the second firm in the U.S. the second private firm in the U.S. to recognize its employees' right to establish a union. And he is currently part of the bargaining committee working to negotiate that union's first contract. Valerie Lechon is assistant director at the New School's Urban Systems Lab. She is a strategist, researcher, and designer focused on driving just transitions in the interactions between social, ecological, and technological systems within our built environment. Val has written and published extensively on repositioning architecture and construction to be more sustainable and socially equitable, typified by her major contribution to the important publication Beyond Capitalism, Organizing Architecture Education for the Journal of Architectural Education. She has racked up numerous awards for designing and promoting a more environmentally just world, including a Presidential Award for Academic Excellence back in the day. Ben.
Woo! All right, is that too loud? Is that okay? Perfect. All right. Thank you, Sanjeev. I'm so excited to be here. I don't usually get to talk to architects, so I was really excited about the opportunity. I've written a little bit about architecture in a book we did a few years ago about called The Beach Beneath the Streets, Contested New York's Public Spaces. When during the Occupy movement, the book was gonna come out a few months before Occupy started, and people said, what could this esoteric, privately owned public spaces have to do with the social movement? Why would you care about that? And then we had a whole book about architects repelling people, building spaces they were supposed to build, but repelling people from having access to those spaces. So it's always interesting, questions about enforcement. So let's talk I want to talk a little bit about social movements, enforcement, labor, and knowing our rights, given all that's happened in the world in the last few weeks. I mean, for me, it's still important for us to be stakeholders in this environment, to know our rights, to know our power. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so let's stay engaged, even if it's horrible. Let's stay engaged. Because knowledge is power, and we need a lot of it. Where do we get it? Countless places. The news, public policy research, data collection, credible resources. So I want to talk a little bit about labor for a second. For 6 years, I was the chapter chair of the professional staff, the CityTech chapter of the Professional Staff Congress at our campus. And we got new contracts, 2 new contracts. We were able to reduce our course load for full-time academics, increase healthcare for workers, and most importantly, during COVID, the only time we ever threatened to strike, we were threatening to strike because they were trying to bring people into a lab that was really dangerous during COVID, and CUNY pulled back. So I'm a big fan of collective power when you use it in a smart way, but I'm also a fan of win-win solutions. I think that's the best thing we can do is work together. We work with our administration. Twice a semester we meet and we have collegial conversations. I think and it's really, really important. I think we can get a lot done by being friends. That's super important. Even when we disagree, super important. So let me talk a little bit about labor. I first started thinking about labor when I was a grad student at University of Chicago. And we were researching the Hull House movement. And what was so wonderful that I got so excited about the Hull House movement is Jane Addams, the iconic American organizer, helps organize immigrants that moved to Chicago and getting them housing. And then she said, well, you're not just gonna get you housing, we're gonna get you organized. And the first thing she found out with issues they wanted to organize was their labor conditions. Their kids were working. We didn't have labor laws at this point. Their kids are working, and they were working in sweatshops. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 kids. There's a lot of kids working in sweatshops. And Jane Addams, the social scientist, was like, let's collect some data. How big is this problem? Oh, It's really big. And she got the ear of the governor of Illinois and the ear of the president, Teddy Roosevelt, and we got some labor laws. So I think it's really, really important. Children's labor laws in the state of Illinois. And then, of course, as New Yorkers, we all know about the Triangle Skirtway factory fire, where like 1911, where like 100 people died. And that sort of led to some New Deal reforms, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage, banned child labor for businesses involved in interstate commerce, and required overtime pay. It also set the 8-hour workday in place. So important. We should thank the labor movement for that. We got the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed us to collectively bargain. And believe me, super important to have. I mean, I've worked at private universities where we had no unions and people lost their jobs, and I've worked at public universities, and having a union behind you helps freedom in the classroom. It really helps freedom in the classroom. So I'm grateful for unions. I'm grateful for what we're able to do with unions. I'm also grateful for the questions unions are asking. One of the questions we've been asking is, how do we make our working conditions more manageable? How do we enforce the laws that we have on the books right now? One of the most important, I think, panels we organized a couple of weeks ago was a panel on decarbonizing CUNY. Right now, the problem that we've heard is that CUNY's building a lot of new buildings, and they're using more carbon emissions than the old buildings. And the question is, how do we use our public policies right now to actually build buildings that are going to reduce carbon emissions? Because right now, we're sort of facing a problem. I mean, from 2014 to 2019, carbon emissions intensity across a subset of 117 out of 300 CUNY campuses, buildings, rose by 15% in comparison to carbon emissions dropping in other government buildings. So, our campuses use an inordinate amount of energy, but we can do better. We have in New York City, in New York State, the Community Environment Protection Act, as well as Local Law 97. We've seen new buildings that, again, are using more carbon emissions than the old buildings. So what do we do about it? With the Build Public Renewables Act, the CCPA, and Local Law 97, the goal is to reduce emissions produced by the city's largest buildings by 40% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. We can bring this conversation into classrooms. I mean, we've seen it at Smith College, they've actually been able to do something about this. So I think, question is, can we do it at CUNY? Does anybody actually think we're going to meet that goal? I'm just sort of interested to see, does anybody think we're going to reduce emissions produced by the city's largest buildings by 40%? Anybody think we're going to be able to? What do we think we have to do to make that happen? I mean, can we use these laws? Can we use our enforcement mechanism to force the issue? We're working with our administration to talk about this possibility, but the first part begins with talking about what these policies mean. I mean, President Biden in the Inflation Reduction Act gives us actual tools to use solar, to build more solar panels, to move into to move into renewables. Will we do that? I don't know. I'm interested in hearing. I'm also, part of why I wanted to come here was to talk with architects about how we do this work. How do we build buildings that, while there's intent, like with the privately owned public spaces, the intent was to create public spaces. It wasn't to create spaces that no one can use. The best public spaces are well-used public spaces. I think our need right now is, we have a need to petition the government for redress of grievances. But without access to public space, questions about democracy basically go out the door. So architects, how do we build public spaces that people want to use, that people want to sit in, that they want to have a conversation with at lunch? How do we build those kinds of public spaces? I mean, we've got to know our rights. Right now, we've got a lot of rights. Let's use them, because I'm worried if we don't use them, we possibly could use them, could lose them. Anyway, that's it for me right now. I want to hear from my colleagues, but thank you very much for giving me the time. I appreciate it.
Hi everyone, I'm Kuhn. I think we're going to get some slides pulled up, but in the meantime, I'll just begin introducing myself a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, And then I'm going to tell you a little bit also about our union at my office, which was alluded to earlier. I want to say at the outset, maybe this is clear, but I'm participating tonight in my capacity as a member of the union at our office and as a member of the bargaining committee there. So not necessarily as an official representative of my firm. To get into it a little bit, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to be an architect and organizing at my office, and I'm going to tell you my abbreviated life story through the lens of unions. So I'm a born and bred New Yorker. I grew up here, but even before I was born, my father worked for the city as a municipal employee. He still does. So I grew up in a union household. My dad was in a municipal employee union most of my life. I think that affects the household you grow up in, the stability of your parents' employment, et cetera. And I think as we go through this, it's interesting to think about all the ways we aren't as Americans exposed to unions in our day-to-day life. We know they're not as common as they once were, but there are a lot of ways they touch all of our lives. So I'm also a product of the New York City Public Schools, a deeply important part of who I am and how I came to be here. And that was all through the work of UFT teachers. It's a very interesting and powerful union, and I had a lot of wonderful experiences with those teachers growing up. I am also a product of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago, as you probably know, is a fairly notoriously anti-union institution. They fought for many years their graduate students who were trying to form a union, but I'm happy to report that the graduate students did in recent years successfully form a union. I think they're part of the United Electrical Workers, and just this year they won their first contract, which is very exciting. Which is, well, we'll get to in a second, my relationship with graduate student unions. I had an interlude after college where I worked in the building trades. So I worked at a company called Rex Electric, which is a major electrical subcontracting company in Chicago. I would definitely encourage anyone who's going into architecture, if there's a way you can get exposure to that industry of contracting, the trades, it's really invaluable and interesting and will give you a different perspective from what a lot of architects have. So I wasn't in a union there because I was sort of an administrative worker, but I did work closely with all the electricians that they employed, and that was all IBEW electrical workers. They had about 300 electricians in the field. So then when I turned to architecture, I actually didn't study architecture as an undergraduate, I studied public policy. I went to the University of California at Berkeley, and at that time I was a member of the United Auto Workers, who organized the graduate student instructors at UC Berkeley. And I can't really stress enough how being a unionized graduate student changed the trajectory of my experience in graduate school. It's really what made it possible to be affordable, to leave graduate school with very limited debt, which is fairly unusual in the world of architecture. So I felt extremely well served by that union, and that it really materially changed my whole trajectory of my career coming out of graduate school and coming into the profession. And then I came back to New York. I've worked for the last 6+ years at Sage and Coombe Architects. We're a small firm in Manhattan that mostly works on civic and institutional buildings. A lot of work for public agencies in the city of New York. And last year, in the fall of 2023, we formed the second ever union at a private architectural practice in the United States. We followed Bernheimer Architects, which some of you may know about. And we're organized under the IAM, which is the Machinists and Aerospace Workers. So I can now say, in addition to being an architect, I'm a machinist and aerospace worker. And shout out to David DiMaria, who's here from that union and worked with us all along the way. I think one lesson here too, just to point out, is that unions have better logos than the institutions they're associated with. So all that being said, let's talk a little bit about our union. And I want to walk you a little bit through a mini primer on how you form a union, and I'm going to do it a little bit backwards, and maybe you'll pick up some pieces of what a union is if you're unfamiliar with it, or more details if you're already familiar. But before I get into the details, because the details really can be overwhelming, I wanted to really stress what I feel, and I think this is a common belief, that the union is you. So this is what our union looked like when we were organizing. This is a park near our office. The union ultimately derives its power from the people who are members of it. We're a small union at my office. When we first organized, I think we had 9 or 10 people in our bargaining unit. And if you don't know what a bargaining unit is, that's okay. We can talk about that later as well. So everything I'm about to go into, just remember at the end of the day, it's just you. That's what the union is, and that's the power derives from the collective action. So starting from the end, I do think the basic quality of a union, at least under labor law in the United States, is that you have a contract as workers. And that's sort of in contrast to the way that most workers in the United States are, which is at-will employees. And being an at-will employee, among other things, basically means that your employer can change your conditions of employment at any time for almost any reason. Obviously, they can't break sort of basic laws about harassment, etc. But other than that, they can lay you off or fire you at any time for any reason. They can change things like your hours of work, your wages, etc., with no real formal recourse for the employee. So when you form a union, you have the right to negotiate a contract which changes all of that and establishes sort of rules of the road for the relationship between the employer and the employee and your conditions of employment. So to get to a contract, I just mentioned the word bargaining. You have to bargain first. And that's what we're doing at my office right now. You heard that I'm on the bargaining committee. So this is the process by which the union, the employer meet and discuss, find common ground, sometimes have conflict, probably always have conflict, and decide what can be in that contract. Before you can do that, you have to actually have the union, right? So, like I mentioned, we formed our union about a year ago, and the way that we formed our union was through a process called voluntary recognition. To make a very long story short here, voluntary recognition essentially means that you ask your employers to have a union and they say, okay, you can have one. And it's voluntary. And at our office, amongst the people in our bargaining unit, we were unanimous in our desire for a union, which is somewhat unusual and maybe more possible at a small firm like ours. But that's one reason voluntary recognition was the logical path for us. You may have heard more commonly of a union election. Union elections are very well defined in terms of how they're run, the bureaucratic processes around them. In our case, it didn't make sense, especially considering we were unanimous, but in many cases you do have a union election, and you probably maybe heard about signing union cards, things of that nature, and that's all part of this process of forming the union. But I think most importantly, before all of that, you have to do organizing, and I think we'll all talk probably more about what organizing is because that one word has so much in it. Organizing is one-on-one conversations. Organizing is, that meeting in the park I showed you a photo of earlier. Organizing is a lot of work of writing down what you want, working it through, writing letters, figuring out where the power lies in your union and your office and your broader industry. And one thing that you learn when you're organizing is that you're doing it as part of a network, and it's extremely relational. So I just want to call out 2 kind of organizations that were critical for us, and this isn't everyone by any means, but AWU, Architectural Workers United, is an organization that coordinates work between various architecture offices right now that are attempting to form unions. So Bernheimer I mentioned, there have been other public campaigns at 2 other offices, and there are many people in architecture who are really invested in organizing in unions as a way to move the profession to a better place, and we worked a lot with those people. And then sort of in parallel to that is the IAM, which I mentioned earlier, and they are a national union that under their sort of non-traditional sectors division, David can correct me if I'm using the wrong words, really helped us out. And we can talk more about affiliating with national unions and why we picked this one. it's not necessarily required that you do, but this whole process can be fairly arcane, and it's good to work with people who have experience and can help teach you how organizing works and how to be effective as a union. Now, all of this is under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Act and Board, which is essentially the main law and the main governing agency that regulates union activity in the United States. So there's a lot of rules to all of this and processes and et cetera, and it's all underneath that, and you have to understand that, and you learn a lot about it as you go through this process. And I guess there is a part about the future too. You know, beyond a contract, I think we're all in the architectural world and beyond very excited about the power that unions have beyond just the contract, because there is a lot of power there, and we can talk about union density, which is basically describes when unions become more widespread in an industry, the power that you can collectively have beyond an individual company, firm, office, etc. And maybe we can talk more about that tonight. So that's the quick intro. Thanks all for being here, and I will pass it off to Valerie.
Hi everyone, it's an honor to be here. Really thrilled to be part of this conversation on labor in the profession of architecture and in times of increasing uncertainty. I'm going to start by contextualizing our topic. In today's collective imaginary, labor often accompanies unions, which most strongly evoke the early to mid 20th century, the period between the 90s and the 40s, the peak of American industrial might and global influence. We look back on this era and notice how distant it feels, how much the world has changed since. Here we see domestic workers on strike in Harlem to bargain for inclusion into minimum wage and maximum work hour laws. So, you know, the beginning of unions was not always intersectional. We consider the innovation cycles that separate us today from the labor unions of the first half of the 20th century, and think about how transformed our society, how the nature of work has been changed by these evolutions. Now that we have the personal computer and the internet, now that innovation cycles are not only shorter but more transformative, now that artificial intelligence and machine learning are reshaping the very nature of work itself, raising new questions about the relationship between labor, automation, and professional expertise. So how could unions, with their practice defined 100 years ago, with the very specific mechanism of the National Labor Board law, have any relevance today? And so the answer is that unions offer a rich window into the world of organized labor. Unions are one of the many kinds of organizer labor groups. Other examples include worker cooperatives, which are businesses owned and democratically managed by their employees, who share profits and make decisions through equal voting rights. If you're curious about cooperatives, I actually brought this book written by a peer. You're welcome to circulate it if you want. So organizing, again, product, worker cooperatives, product of organizing. But also we have mutual aid societies, which are voluntary organizations where members pool resources and support each other during times of need, with healthcare, insurance, education, emergency assistance through collective contributions and shared decision-making. There are community labor alliances that are partnerships between labor unions and community organizations, such as, for instance, tenant unions, that combine workplace organizing with broader social justice issues, right? Like we saw the women who were excluded from early labor policy. Working together to achieve shared goals for both workers and local communities. And so organized labor refers to workers who have formally united or organized into groups to advance their collective interests. But the defining characteristic of union is the verb that describes their activities is organizing. So organizing, I would say, is the subject of my work in general and my talk tonight. And I will introduce you to this concept in a bit more detail. So the definition I would give it is, in short, organizing is a social practice for systems change. A more descriptive answer is quoted. Organizing is strategic collective action. It refers to the social processes of arranging and structuring elements, resources, or information in a systemic and purposeful manner in order to achieve a specific goal or objective. Through organizing, solidarity and resilience are cultivated, enabling individuals and communities to pool resources and confront challenges as a united front. The key points here are: organizing is not activism. They're not equivalent. Organizing is durational work consisting of strategies, tactics, and rituals. Organizing is collective. Fundamental to organizing is knowing when to step forward and when to step back, and when and how to act. Organizing is about power, and that involves both wanting and fighting power. So this definition came from this book that came out in July, and in which the chief idea is to teach organizing in architecture education. So I'm one of 7 co-authors on this book. You can see here where they're located, across the US in DC, Minneapolis, Chicago, but also in Argentina, Australia, New Zealand. We're all architects, educators, and researchers, and most importantly, organizers. So I would like to tell you a little bit more about how we started organizing together. So for those who are unfamiliar with the lobby, it is a grassroots organization of architectural workers that advocates for just labor practices and an equitable built environment. The organization started about 10 years ago, and over the years has engaged architecture with organizing in many innovative ways, always seeking to segue uncertainty into solidarity. It is rooted in a manifesto that has evolved since its early version on the screen. Its practices are very much anchored in the tradition of direct action through protest and strikes and dissent. In activities enshrined in community agreements through specific conversation methods. Its original working group. So working groups are a big part of this community agreements. It's how a lot of things happen. The original working group is unionization, building worker power, but it has also many other facets. The same topic of cooperative networks, so it would be conceiving of architecture, practicing on a large scale through networks of cooperatives that together kind of form a unique economy. There's a few in New York. Women in Practice with Lindsay Harkima is one that I love learning about. It's not lost on me that this is an AIA event, but I thought I had to bring it up. A big campaign happened right after the Trump election, with the AIA response that was basically saying like the Trump presidency is a good thing for us, to which there were letters and all kinds of engagement to build awareness around the fact that this is not representative of our profession as a whole. But another important topic is the Green New Deal Working Group, and Martin here is in the room, is my co-conspirator on this. So it kind of launched when the Green New Deal was introduced in 2019, and we soon went into the pandemic. So we had this Earth Week spanning the globe with events on Zoom. But quickly we started to look at all the Green New Deal policy resolutions, proposals that were put out, mapping congressional support and trying to understand the role of architects in it, and mostly the missing role that we ended up writing this policy document, seeking to present it to congressional officials, getting endorsements to build momentum around this set of recommendations to better respond in our sort of federal policy to the needs for change in the built environment. There's definitely a unique role of unions that was envisioned, in this process, in sort of setting about new economies for architects, for the production, and sometimes the deconstruction of the built environment, since we all know there's some difficult interactions there. And one of these tools that we use to kind of disseminate this process or think about how to build power around policy, but also how to build power in the workplace, how to guide people into this process of organizing, was this power mapping tool that was defined by some user flows. So it was this idea of using this product design approaches to kind of scale some of these organizing efforts. And in a similar ethos, there's this film project that will be out probably next year. It's a set of interviews with people that have organized, a lot of them in the lobby, to try to portray these various stories and theories of change that drive all of the campaigns. So how I met my co-authors was one of those working groups called the Architecture Beyond Capitalism School, launched in 2021. So the first session was a 6 weeks online program with these 3 themes of capitalism, labor, and collectives, and very unique modes of interaction. We didn't have like the lecturers were participants, and there were very unique sets of interactions and a lot of great feedback that then informed the later versions of the school. There were about, in terms of the distribution in the school, there were a third of practitioners, a third of academics, a third of students, so really a broad-ranging set of participants in the field. Some power mapping exercises, and the later versions focused on the studio and future belonging. But so that leads me to this book that I don't want to dwell on. I just want to introduce you to you briefly. So organizing is really introduced in it in the same way that I've just talked you through, without necessarily going through all the lobby campaigns. And then we apply this idea of organizing to architecture education by breaking it down in scales. So we have the studio, the curriculum, the university, and the nation state as defined frameworks to look at to understand sites of possibilities when organizing. So the book was co-authored really in this organizing ethos with a lot of the same rules that we apply when we work together towards unions or defining policy. This sort of endless editing processes and comments and discussions. And then the way it worked technically was this round robin. So we'd work with a chapter for about a week, and then we'd meet on Sunday and then present the work we had done, get presented a chapter, and it would be passed on like that for a few times. I think there were 2 or 3 rounds of these. But anyway, so part 1, organizing, is ensued by this how-to, this series of methodologies that we have used. They are not by any means comprehensive, but they're detailed in the book and a place to start. And then these scales of organizing are introduced through these sites of possibility at each scale. So sites of possibility, we define them as organizing frameworks and relationships that serve as points of entry for organizing architecture education and mobilizing change in the discipline and the built environment. So throughout the chapters, you'll find these specific sites of possibility. For the studio, the content, the practices, the relationships, and the spaces. For the curriculum, the curricular content, the curricular practices, relationships, and spaces. The university, co-learning models, equitable metrics, financial interventions, internal partnerships, external partnerships. The nation state, it's really this idea of transforming the nature of the profession. There was this comment earlier on architects not being paid as much as lawyers and doctors. And I think when I spoke with a sociologist called Magali Sarfton, she said architects don't control their markets. So that means there's essentially like a deprofessionalization of the field compared to lawyers, compared to doctors, that just makes the work of architects be subject to other actors coming in. So I think that creates a lot of gray zones that creates difficult working conditions for us. And so we sort of find modes of action through looking at this large scale thing. After the nation state, we look into this series of case studies that are themed and also tagged by scale. And then we end with this notion of toward the planetary, which is also a scale, but also non-scalar, because it's about the very small scale interactions that also sort of ripple out to the large. So I invite you to read the book, but the reason I also want to introduce it is that I want to show you how we applied it with Lindsay through the case of adjuncts who came together to organize because they found they had really unfortunate working conditions, semester to semester, etc. So the scalar system really helped understand the kinds of interactions that we want to foster to bring change to the condition of adjuncts. So it's represented in this GIF, and it's also described in detail in the article Structural Change. Basically advocating for the ACSA and the AIA, but also for coalitions across disciplines to be made to address this issue. So thinking about, inter-union conversations, and then thinking about the kind of policy frameworks that we need in order to foster different material conditions for these people. And I think in architecture, we can also engage our institutions, since it kind of goes beyond just the condition of adjuncts, as we all know. And so also, we have this survey that's still live, so if you're an adjunct and you're unhappy, we invite you to fill out this survey. It's linked in the article. That brings me to this question of uncertainty again, right? This is a really famous framework, the known knowns, the unknown unknowns. But what's more interesting are the known unknowns, the things we know that we don't know, and the unknown knowns, the things that we know but don't realize we know. And that leads me to the work that I do currently, which is often portrayed as technical assistance. So it's basically like developing, building capacity to be able to let folks organize. So all of this is in response to climate, but also nature and pollution. So it's, I really like this framework of sets, which kind of conceptualize, it's social, ecological, technological systems. It's a way of contextualizing the built environment with regards to people and social interactions and the economy, but also nature and resources, the commons, the atmosphere. We were talking about carbon emissions earlier. And so a lot of the work that I do today is grounded in this lens and helps us develop tools that are then used to help people organize for change in the built environment and adapting to ensure that people are safe when it floods or in heat waves, or have better health outcomes when it comes to pollution. And so one of these tools is Climate IQ. It basically seeks to make available hyper-local climate risk data. So if you think about, and it's all about, the reason I wanted to talk about this too was like AI was a theme in this series. And so I think there's also a way to use some of these emerging tools to not only feel threatened by them, but to understand how we can harness them to drive change. So Climate IQ will basically downscale all of the climate risk data, which is often at a very large scale, to be able to tell, to sort of hierarchize adaptation efforts when it comes to budgets, etc. But also, let frontline communities know about the risks they're facing. I thought this would be a nice way to kind of come around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. That's really informative and interesting. I will open it up to questions.
Thanks again, it was great. And I got a million questions, but I'll start with Ben. First, I guess the first question is, what does SCA stand for?
SCA is Sage and Coombe Architects. It's the name of my firm, yeah.
Gotcha. Recognize that, sorry. Anyway, I imagine that there would be sort of pressure on the entire industry if there were a large firm, like an SOM or something, that was unionized, because if the pay scale was set at that firm, it tends to trickle down. Are there any efforts underway on at some of the largest firms?
That's a good question, because the answer is yes. There are two public campaigns. So one was at a firm called Snowhetta that you may be familiar with if you've seen the tallest building in Brooklyn that was designed by Shop Architects, which is another firm that had an organizing effort. Now, both of those efforts, I would say, are in limbo at this point. There's specific details to what's happened at each of those firms, and those aren't either of them the largest firms that are out there too. They're not at an SOM scale, but they're much bigger than, for example, my office, which had about 18 employees in total at the time we organized and formed our union. So yes, I think that is certainly the ambition, and I think thinking about the architecture lobby and some of their working groups on unions and organizing, I think there was a vision that unions in architecture would maybe start at firms of that scale, and what the evidence is showing is that it may have to go in a different direction. We've had more success at smaller firms where, at least in the case of my firm, I think some of the ills of our industry aren't as severe as they are at larger and better known firms. And I think you can end up in a sweet spot where there's a certain buy-in in a firm like mine by employees. There's a certain congeniality between management and employees as well, that and the scale makes it easier as well. So we're really hopeful that these smaller unions that have had success in organizing will serve as an inspiration and help teach also larger firms to organize. And Architectural Workers United, AWU, is essentially the coordinator of all this effort. So we have a steering committee with basically representatives from each of the campaigns at individual firms, so we can work together and learn from one another. So that is definitely the vision.
Cool. And just one last question before I pass the mic. How do you deal with the idea, I mean, that architects aren't necessarily assembly line workers or something, all doing the exact same job? And obviously, some people have, whether you want to say, more talent or better performance or something. How in a union organization like that do you distinguish these different abilities that you have within a firm?
So to the first question about how does a union in an architecture firm, which is very different from a assembly line in a factory, how does that make sense? It's really tricky. So the labor law in the United States is 100 years old or approaching 100 years old, and it is structured for a world in which unions mostly existed in large assembly line settings. So it doesn't work perfectly for a lot of the modern industries that are organizing with smaller organizations, with more highly educated workers, with different ratios between and more porous boundaries between management and employee, salaried workers versus hourly workers. It doesn't work perfectly at all. And I wonder personally if longer term there will be a reckoning point with that, because I don't think the current system is necessarily going to serve us permanently. That being said, when I said the union is you, I think what's embedded in that is that the contract is what you want it to be as well. Contracts can be very broad, they can be very specific. There are some traditional forms they take, but they don't have to take that form. So what we're finding and what Bernheimer architects have found as well is that in some areas we can take from the history and there's well-established patterns we can follow for a contract. For other areas that point specifically to a lot of the conversation about sustainability and resilience, we're sort of writing a new playbook and feeling it out, and it's not easy by any means, especially because it's this whole world is run by legal minds, and they don't like language that hasn't been written before. So we're trying to figure it out as we go. I think we'll establish some new structures. To your question about sort of merit and advancement within an office, I would say for me personally, that's a little bit of a separate question from your right to organize and have a union, because regardless of your talent or your abilities, I think you have a right to collective action and to be have that solidarity with your other colleagues. And the other thing I would say is typically the structure of a contract is that it sets a minimum, a base, like a expectation for what is standard, what is humane, what are the values we all agree upon in this office, and there's typically nothing that prevents you from going above and beyond that. So, for example, you may set a salary base, but that doesn't typically prevent individual employees from negotiating above that. We may negotiate a certain number of days off a year, for example, in a contract, but it doesn't prevent you, and you may explicitly even say in the contract that it doesn't prevent you from being granted more beyond that. Another component of it, and this will be interesting to see as unions become more widespread in architecture, is that line between being in the union and not, which one thing I've learned is that that's a very salient detail of organizing a union that you might not think about if you're not involved in doing it. And employees can, advance their way out of the union too. And I've thought about that for myself personally on the trajectory of my career, and that's another component to your question, I think. There is a point where you're no longer covered under the contract typically.
I've got to say that in my customer system or work for New York Times, all the writers are unionized. It's sort of the same thing.
Yes.
So they're going to examine. Can you repeat the question?
So he was commenting about the union of writers at the New York Times, and I think that's a good example. Journalism and also tech workers to a certain degree of somewhat analogous professions to architecture that do have strong labor movements right now. And I think they are good examples for new structures in contracting, and especially at the New York Times. I also know people in that union. They're really pushing on the edges of what typically has been in union contracts, and it's quite interesting.
I had a question for all three of you. I just want to thank you all because you each bring such an important dimension to the understanding of this subject. My basic, if you tell me from where I grew up and what I'm used to, the union organization is built there to provide a structure to a commercial entity that has an owner, a CEO, a CFO, and executives, stockbrokers, the haves, versus the workers who are the have-nots. And it's a way of leveling the field for to bring those to some kind of, provide the have-nots, so to speak, the workers, with a more equitable distribution of the collective, what is being gained. Whereas in architecture firms, especially small architecture firms, where is that coming from? Because the owner is probably as equally in the same situation. So how do you, there's nothing to share, but I wonder if there is another model of collective labor that allows a firm to flourish in a way that uses the distribution of both the risk and the costs of having a firm, sharing it, and perhaps elevating. I wonder if there's another model, so to speak, for organized labor within an architecture firm that you're aware of.
I'll just quickly follow, and I want to hear from you guys on this today. I think we have to think about the idea of a right to the city. So the idea that a city is an ever mutable place, ever evolving place, and the negotiation between workers and management in lived environment is always going to be part of that. And I think that right now is the time for big imagination, for thinking about social movements, think about how we can make cities livable. This is all about local. Right now, it's all local, all politics is local. So we have to think about how can our lived environment be a livable place. We just, 2 times in New York in the last 20 years, congestion pricing has died. And yet, 1 step up, 2 steps back, we're probably gonna have congestion pricing unless they tank it in the next month. So a lived environment means a place that we can all live and work and get to work. And hopefully architecture can be part of that, as I talked about with the Occupy movement, but I also talked about that with enforcing local laws that help us to have a lived environment. And I think that if we don't do that, I don't know what kind of a city we're going to have. And I would hope that architects, while thinking about their vocation, also have this bigger picture of what kind of a lived environment, what kind of city this can be. So anyway, I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so exciting to hear about. I agree with the big imagination. I think it's a very uncertain time, so there's also a lot of opportunity in the vulnerability and opportunity for change. There's obviously like worker cooperatives, but I do think that we can even think about maybe letting go of the architecture profession altogether, just because I think there's a lot of ways to collaborate with all the people that make the city that is not currently cultivated and encouraged at all in a very insular profession. There's, ways to practice design, there's this major disruption by digital tools, by data, and we need to understand how to integrate science into our decision-making process, how to respond to economic data, how to be kind of fluent in those languages and able to collaborate. And the way that I was educated in architecture really did not foster these modes of exchange at all. What is not rewarded by the profession as it is. So my sort of call to action is just leave.
No, don't listen to her.
So let me try to answer your question specifically as well. And I think this gets to the idea about thinking big and being imaginative, because I think one thing I've learned in the whole process is to make it happen, you have to make it feel not radical to the people who are doing it. And I think one thing that makes it feel radical, especially to people who run firms, is that they have this perception that it's about like a class war within the firm, which maybe it is at the end of the day. But I think it's not necessarily about that, especially in an architecture firm, and money isn't the only issue on the table in a union contract. And it's in no one's interest, especially at a small firm, to do things at the firm that are going to make the firm insolvent, non-competitive, that sort of thing. And I think you have to remember that. And I think in being in negotiation right now about our contract, that's ever present, right? Neither the employer nor the employees want to cause a condition that's going to harm everyone. And harm to the firm harms everyone at a small firm. So I think that's part one of that. And I think part two is that it gets back to what I said earlier, is that regardless of the reasons for the union, and I think at my office, management really, when we first asked for a union, was very preoccupied with the why. And it makes total sense why. Like, the management at a firm would be concerned about that. But I think what we all kind of came to understand, and it took a lot of organizing and just conversation to get there, is that the existence of the union comes actually before what's in the contract, because it's about a structure for how you interact in the office. And for better or worse, legally, like this traditional format under the NLRB of a union is one of the main legal structures we have that can formalize that conversation. And I think it actually just brings conversations that exist anyway into a legal structure that enforces it. So we talk about things we've always talked about in our office, but now it's going to end up in a contract, and it's not going to end up by the wayside, which I think is an experience that a lot of architects have had, of conversations within an office that maybe by no individual's fault or not by no ill intention don't kind of get to the end result. I do wish there were other structures, and there are other structures, but they're less common. Cooperatives, profit sharing, etc., and they're not exclusive of unions either. You can have a cooperative that's unionized as well, because even in large cooperatives, there is management and there are employees. We don't have a lot of examples of that. Maybe you know about them more intimately than I do. But I think those are some of the reasons we ended up with the union structure at my office, despite it being a small office where, yeah, there aren't big bucks being tossed around.
So I actually had a question from sort of a student perspective. You guys are doing work of organizing while you're sort of in the profession, and I was wondering, are there ways for students to help like cultivate a more informed workforce before entering the, like, does that look like maybe workshops designed to help understand benefits packages or something like that?
It's a great question, and I think the same principle that knowledge is power is the way to begin this. I think the more you become informed stakeholders, the more the dialogue expands. You're going to get hired because of what you know. You're going to get hired also because of how you engage with power in a collegial way or in a professional way, or in an assertive way. So I think the more that, I'm also a big believer in the fake it till you make it school, right? Which is you talk about being an architect, you talk about buildings, you study buildings, then one day you get a job, you get to study something and you get the job and you do it. So I think the more that you are an informed stakeholder that commands respect, the further on when you sit in the room with the board, when you sit in the room with the president, to be able to talk in an informed way is what's going to move you forward into the labor force and beyond that. So and that's my little 2 cents worth, but I think this isn't the time to hide. This is the time to be more engaged than ever as the clown show begins. So thank you.
In the architecture lobby, there's a lot of student chapters, or at least there were. And so there's a lot of resources that are kind of have been developed to just help students foster these conversations among themselves. And so yeah, you can be a chapter steward. You're really like running the org, but it's I think from my experience with like beginning to organize in places where that culture really is not. It's like, even if you have 3 people that show up, it's like the best conversation ever, because you're talking about all the elephants in a room that there's no space to talk about otherwise. But there's a lot of other organizations that are, like youth-led and fostering modes of organizing. Like Sunrise Movement is one that comes to mind. There's a lot of other architecture or design-centered organizations like Design as Protest, and others that are great places to start. And if you meet some of those more senior organizers, I'm sure they'll be really delighted to hear about you and guide you.
I would just add to that a little bit about my individual experience. I think there are a lot of pathologies we have as architects, and a lot of them, for better or worse, get cultivated in schools or passed down in schools. And one of the big ones that I think is really counter to organizing is a mentality that good architecture requires like frenetic and super extended hours of work. And what that does, and I've really experienced this in my own career, and it's not easy to resolve, is that you come out of school with a feeling that to do what you want to do architecturally, you need to work so hard you have no space in your life for anything else. So all those organizations, you have no time to get to them because you're working on your studio project or what have you. And one thing I've really felt in doing this organizing work is I don't want to replicate the bad things that are going on in the profession in our union and the work we do organizing. So if I think our world as architects is bad at managing time and staffing, for example, I want to be really disciplined about using our time efficiently and having clear roles within our union and that sort of thing. So I would say for students, I would really encourage you to, while you're in school and especially when you're making that transition out of school, take the time to take a step back, take a deep breath, think about like how you're spending your time. Is it reflective of what your values are? And remember that to be a good architect, I would really say you don't actually have to subscribe to this mentality of the sort of design side of architecture being something that dominates your life completely. In fact, I think it's actually kind of the reverse when you get to practice, that the things that are valued in school in terms of quote unquote architectural skills and the design aspects of architecture are actually not most of your time. Other skills are much more important to be a good architect. And those skills actually align better, in my experience, with this organizing work. The things that are more relational, more procedural, writing, communicating, understanding public policy, etc. It's a big part of architecture. It's also a big part of unions. Whereas knowing how to do waterproofing, for example, doesn't have much to do with forming a union.
I have an ill-formed question, but I'm curious, as labor unions form, as the country goes through a process of either regulating more in the design field or construction, or possibly deregulating, what is the net effect on the shadow economy? That represents about 10% of the American GDP, which is in the trillions of dollars. And I think that's a problem that the CUNY program, CityTech, is uniquely connected to, because we do have either students who work in that economy or have parents that come from that economy. And what I found really interesting about your talk is you're tying organizing all the way through to climate change. But one of the biggest challenges is the inability for either side, management or labor, to draw in the people who participate in the shadow economy. And I wonder if you've had any thoughts about that.
When you say draw in, bring that into organizing?
I think, yes, representation, bring them into organizing. There has to be reasons for that too.
Well, I think organizing around housing is a way to engage people with these resources or these practices. But yeah, the shadow economy, as I understand it, it's people who are hired, like as contractors, kind of like Baron HR was in the news recently, or we're thinking about Uber and their fight against regulation that gets all of their delivery workers to be employees, recognized as employees. So, I mean, I think talking about the policy that is directly impacting these economies is probably the best place to start. Yeah, and there's a lot of different narratives that exist, that once you talk to people and you look at the news they're reading, you realize that there's all of these things to talk about and unpack around this, the decision making when it comes to political elections, and what's better for the economy. Yeah, I think sensibilizing these groups towards those policy projects that are directly targeted toward their economic practices is certainly a place to start.
And I think I would add to that, and maybe this relates to the question earlier about unions and large firms. I do think there's sort of a spectrum of how precarious workers who are doing architectural work are. And in my mind, the question about large firms gets a little bit to, I think our experience in actually organizing has been workers at those larger firms and better known firms tend to be more precarious for various reasons. And I think the shadow economy that you're talking about is like even beyond them on that spectrum. And I think it's a little bit reversing what traditionally has been the strategy, because historically it's been, at least the flashier stories are those for those like most precarious workers, right? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory or what have you. But I think at our office, for example, we've all felt that while some of the problems of the industry exist at our office, they're nowhere near as severe as they are in other firms, let alone sort of the underworld. And that's a reason we want to lead, because we have the privilege of being able to be visible about this. We're relatively stable as workers even before our union, and stable as a firm as well. And if we can be out here talking about it, be part of a national union which is connected to other industries in a way that architecture offices aren't typically, that moves closer at least to that world, maybe not directly to it. Once you start having density where there's it's widespread in an industry, that really changes the conversation, because it becomes very visible to the workers who aren't in it what can be gained from it. There's a lot more protection they can find by moving towards it. So I think it moves in the right direction, very slowly, but it does.
Another thing that comes to mind is finding solidarity philanthropists to be able to have enough time to look at this issue, the complexity of it, the unique position that your school has with regards to this economy and the opportunities that are there. So philanthropy economists are going to be donor organizers, people who really consider themselves organizers and sort of coming out of these traditions, but that also end up with these funds. And ultimately, when dealing with these large scale issues, like these employers have all of these extra money to hire the anti-union lawyers and the anti-union consultants to sort of spread disinformation, and so you also need to consider that. And then for such a large economic issues, you said in the $1 trillion, you really need to bring in unfortunately philanthropic support to be able to drive this grassroots movement and give them the power not to die off when there's another electoral cycle. Or so one of them, she's the writer of this book, Leah Hun Hendricks, and she has a network of people. So she writes about this specifically while being like an oil heiress who was part of the Occupy movement. So I think there's a role in that philanthropy plays to support these efforts and be able to study them and understand them. I think it's an important part that we don't necessarily talk about when we talk about organizing.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for the conversation, both of you. I want to maybe, since I have the final question, end with the sort of broad stroke question. I think the comment about this idea of deprofessionalizing, right, kind of resonated with me, because you're totally right. We have this pathology of believing, we call it the architectural profession, right? We don't call it any other way. So we already kind of put ourselves onto this pedestal to separate ourselves from what's quote unquote called just work or labor, right? And we've been trained that way from the school, like you're supposed to follow the passion, right? And then we've gone through the licensure process that kind of put us almost at the equal path as, let's say, lawyers and doctors, but in reality, we don't hold the same set of cards or control as they do, right? So I think that kind of puts us in a very precarious place. So perhaps the question is then, how do we define architecture? And how do we define architecture profession? And I'm curious to hear your answer, like what do you think is architecture or what it should be? And what do you think is architecture profession and how it should be in the context of the conversation that we've had?
30 seconds.
I mean, I've already said this. I think we don't really need an architecture profession. I think it's okay to study architecture. Yeah, the licensure framework is so outdated. It's so laborious. It's so expensive. It's so useless. I don't think we need an architecture profession, if you ask me.
I would say overall I agree with that. I am a licensed architect. I've been through it all. It's not pretty. I don't think it's completely meritless. You know, there is health, safety, and welfare, and I think in any new structure we need to consider how that works. But I do agree, like in the same way that the structure of the National Labor Relations Act doesn't really bear much resemblance to the way work actually happens now in these modern industries. I think licensure is built for a very outdated idea of how buildings get built. And also, licensure as an institution and our other institutions like the AIA really preserve a relationship between architects and the building trades that's completely toxic and counterproductive to worker power. And I don't know what it would look like for that to be different. I mean, there are a lot of practices doing design build, architect-led design build in interesting ways. And I think it would be great to move towards a world where that is more common, and the adversarial relationships we built up in our industry between these like somewhat arbitrary lines get softened or eliminated. And I think changing licensure would be a beginning to do that, more paths to licensure that don't run through a very fixed idea of what the path to becoming an architect is or what an architect does is. Because the reality when you get to practicing as an architect is that it's extremely broad. There's so many things there that trying to have this one rigid process that encompass it all doesn't serve us all that well, I think, and keeps people out too. And our profession has a huge problem with keeping people out of it who should be in it. Yeah, it's nice to think about that because in the day-to-day of forming a union and doing very traditional architectural practice, there's not a lot of time to consider that, but hopefully that's where we're headed. I wanted to end maybe just to say a phrase that I learned in doing all this organizing work that's become really important to me is participation is power. So I just want to say thank you all for participating tonight and forming a little power here, and hopefully this inspires you to do that more.
Thanks everyone for coming. Do check the website for all the events that are right around the corner, including tomorrow's on the menu with specific conditions if you need one learning unit. And happy Thanksgiving.